so good to see you again, my dears. As I told you last time, I am so excited to introduce you to the world of clauses and complex sentences. They are so important for helping our kiddos understand the stuff they need for school and also for writing the kinds of language that make them sound literate and write good papers, as I know you do. The better we understand how these complex sentences work, the more we can help our kiddies understand and use them to become literate language users. So let's get started. All right, what's a complex sentence? In the most basic sense, it's a sentence that has more than one predicate. A predicate, I'm sure you remember, my dears, is the verb phrase in the sentence, including both the main verb and any auxiliary verbs and whatever else goes along with the verb, such as adverbs, prepositional phrases, direct and indirect objects, and so forth. So let's just quickly review the difference between a verb and a verb phrase. In this sentence, the dictionary may have had verbs in it. What's the verb in the sentence? That's right, my dears, may have had. Now that verb phrase has three parts: the main verb had and the two auxiliaries, may and have. But it's all one verb phrase. And what's the rest of the predicate? It's the prepositional phrase in it. Good for you. So this is not a complex sentence. It has only one predicate, which contains just one main verb phrase. Now look at this one. A dictionary has verbs in it, but the Bible has proverbs. Does this sentence have more than one predicate? Yes, it does. It has two predicates. The first has verbs in it, and the second has proverbs. And what are the verb phrases in these two clauses? You've got it. In the first one, it's has, which is the main verb, and verbs, which is the direct object, as well as in it, which is the prepositional phrase. The second one also has as the main verb, but in this case, there's just the direct object, proverbs. So this sentence has two predicates, has verbs in it, and has proverbs, and two verb phrases. Both of the main verbs start with has. It's a complex sentence. Each of the two clauses has a subject plus a verb plus an object, the components of a sentence. But when we put them together into a larger sentence, we call each of them a clause. Okay, here's another one of Grammar Granny's grammar jokes. What's the difference between a sentence and a cat? A sentence has a pause at the end of a clause, but a cat has claws at the end of its paws. Okay, Grammar Granny's sorry. I can never resist a lame joke. Now, when two clauses like these each could be a whole sentence on its own, we call them independent clauses. They could each be a separate sentence. The dictionary has verbs in it. The Bible has proverbs. Or they could be joined with a conjunction like but to make a complex sentence. The dictionary has verbs in it, but the Bible has proverbs. Conjunctions that join independent clauses include and then, but, for, nor, or, so then, and yet. And wouldn't you know, there's a special name for all these conjunctions that link independent clauses. They're called coordinating conjunctions. And just to confuse things further, in these kinds of sentences that have two independent clauses linked with a coordinating conjunction, the clauses are sometimes called coordinate clauses. Each clause has equal weight or independence, and one isn't subordinate to the other. Why bother, you might ask? Why bother to make a complex sentence when you could use two simple sentences to say the same thing? Well, there's a reason, my dears. See if you can guess why the complex coordinate clause sentence is more elaborate than the two independent sentences separately. You see, the conjunction but doesn't just hook these two independent clauses together. It specifies a relationship between the two of them. It tells us that the two ideas, or propositions, that the clauses express should be seen in contrast to each other, but gives the two clauses together more meaning than they have separately. It shows that the propositions are not being just stated, but contrasted. The ability to produce or understand complex sentences like these, where we combine ideas in specific ways to express specific relationships between the ideas they express, lets us put a lot of meaning in a small space. We don't have to say, the dictionary has verbs in it, the Bible has proverbs. These two things are in contrast, which would of course ruin the joke, besides being longer and more cumbersome. So these complex structures let us produce sentences that are more filled with meaning and less strung out with words. They make our language more efficient. Now, sentences, of course, can be made up of just one independent clause. When they are, we call them a simple sentence, like this one from Groucho Marx. Time flies like an arrow. Or we can combine two independent clauses with a conjunction, as we just did, to make a complex sentence that expresses a relationship between the two coordinate clauses. To continue Groucho Marx' quotation, time flies like an arrow, but fruit flies like a banana. That's one way to make a complex sentence. But there are other ways too, my dears. We can also use different kinds of clauses called dependent or subordinate clauses. These, unlike our friends the independent clauses, are not complete sentences on their own. They need to be combined with another clause to form a full sentence. Now, we know that sentences always have an independent main clause, and they may have another independent clause linked to them by a coordinating conjunction, as we've just seen. But they may also have one or more dependent clauses or subordinate clauses attached or embedded within them. Stop the video for a minute and see if you can find the subordinate clauses in these sentences. Smiles is the longest word because it has a mile between its first and last letter. If you leave alphabet soup on the stove too long, it could spell disaster. If you said, because it has a mile between the first and the last letter, and if you leave alphabet soup on the stove too long, have a cookie. You found the subordinate clauses. They begin with another kind of conjunction, the subordinating conjunction. Here are some examples of subordinating conjunctions. Although, after, as well as, because, if, since, that, though, unless, until, when, where, whereas, wherever, whether, while, and why. The subordinate clause in a complex sentence always adds information, but it doesn't change the meaning of the main or independent clause of the sentence. So in smiles is the longest word because it has a mile between its first and last letter, the main clause, smiles is the longest word, means the same with or without the subordinate clause. But adding, because it has a mile between the first and last letter, gives more information about the main clause. It explains a reason why it's true. Subordinate clauses, like coordinate ones we talked about earlier, also use the conjunction to specify a relationship between the two clauses, making the sentence denser in meaning. In the case of our example, the relationship is a causal one. We could say the same thing with two simple sentences. We could say smiles is the longest word. The reason for that is there is a mile between the first and last letters. But that's a much less sophisticated, efficient way to say it. In school-age kiddos, helping them learn to condense their longer, less mature sentences to tighter, more mature complex productions, and to be able to understand all the meaning stuffed into these dense sentences is often one of the ways we work on improving their language. Why not stop the video for a minute and see if you can come up with 5 sentences that contain a subordinate clause, each one using a different one of our subordinating conjunctions. If you came up with some examples like, if the pen is mightier than the sword, then why do actions speak louder than words? When Santa is angry, he calls the elves subordinate clauses. A dialect becomes a language after its speakers get an army and a navy. Teachers love their native land, although their favorite nation is explanation. It's good to be awesome, although it's bad to be awful. I hope your examples aren't as silly as mine, but you're getting the idea. Now, I know you're going to hate to hear this, my dears, but just as we can have multiple auxiliaries in a verb phrase, we can also have multiple clauses in a complex sentence. Take a look at this one. My professor insisted that in English, a double negative forms a positive, and in some languages, a double negative is still a negative. But there's no language where a double positive can form a negative. And I answered, yeah. Stop the video for a minute and see if you can find how many clauses are in the first sentence. Did you get an independent clause? My professor insisted that in English a double negative forms a positive. This one actually has two clauses, my dears. One independent, my professor insisted, and one that acts as the direct object of insisted and has its own subject and verb, that in English a double negative forms a positive. But we won't get into the weeds of that right now. And there's also another independent clause, and in some languages, a double negative is still a negative. And a third independent clause, but there is no language where a double positive can form a negative. Again, this independent clause has another clause embedded in it, the independent clause, but there is no language where a double positive can form a negative. But we won't trouble ourselves too much about that right now. My point is, my dears, that you can form sentences with independent clauses and subordinate clauses in lots of different combinations. And you'd be surprised how soon typically developing kiddies do this too. Most use at least some complex sentences by 3.5 and begin combining more than 2 clauses within sentences by 4 or so. Of course, our kiddies with language disorders take longer and often need our help to understand and use these complicated but efficient forms of communication. Well, I think we've stuffed your brain full enough for today, my dears. Come back next time and we'll talk about different types of subordinate clauses. I'll bet you can't wait.